Welcome back. I'm Harper Vance, and on this channel, we expose the truth that silence often hides the greatest power. Today, we're following Vice Admiral Greta Wooten, a commander who controls the steel of the Seventh Fleet and the fate of billion-dollar defense contracts. But to her arrogant family, she's nothing more than a lowly clerk worth mocking at a wedding. They thought they were punching down on a nobody, completely unaware that they were declaring war on the very woman holding the lifeline to their entire empire. The fleet is ready, and the target is locked. Let's get into the story. Standing by the ice sculpture at the breakers in Newport, Rhode Island, I realized that some things never change, no matter how much time passes or how many miles you put between yourself and your past. The mansion was a relic of the Gilded Age, a place built on the backs of people who were never meant to walk through the front door, and tonight I felt like one of them. I held a glass of plain water in my hand, and it felt like the cheapest thing in the room, probably because it was. Everywhere I looked, the so-called upper crust of society, or at least the ones desperately trying to look the part, were swirling in a sea of silk, pearls, and forced laughter. My Aunt Clara drifted past me, the heavy scent of her Chanel perfume almost drowning out the salty breeze coming off the Atlantic, though it could not quite mask the stench of her pretension. She was busy holding court, bragging to anyone who would listen about the 5-tier wedding cake that apparently cost more than a high school teacher's annual salary. I watched my cousin Mark adjusting his tuxedo bow tie in a nearby mirror, laughing with a group of men who looked like they had never broken a sweat in their lives. Nobody really saw me, or more accurately, they chose to look right through me. I was Greta Wooten, wearing a navy blue dress I'd bought in a hurry at Macy's, a dark smudge on their carefully curated canvas of perfection. They had relegated me to table 19, a spot tucked so far back near the kitchen door that every time a server rushed out, the swinging door nearly clipped my shoulder. The clatter of dirty dishes and the smell of industrial dish soap were my primary companions, far away from the soft jazz and the glow of the crystal chandeliers. The atmosphere changed when I saw Chloe approaching our table, moving with the calculated confidence of a predator who knew exactly where the weakest link was hiding. She was draped in a custom-designed bridal gown that seemed to take up the entire aisle, her hand tucked firmly into the arm of her father, Mr. Jennings, the CEO of Jennings Aerospace. Chloe was a girl who had been born at the finish line and spent her whole life convinced she had run a marathon. She spotted me and let out a high-pitched cry that felt more like a summons than a greeting. "Oh, Greta," she exclaimed, her voice dripping with a condescending sweetness that made my skin crawl. "I honestly didn't think you'd make it. Mark said you were so tied up with, what was it again? Some kind of administrative paperwork down at the docks." Mark, standing right there with a face flushed from too much expensive scotch, let out a little huff of a laugh. "Yeah, Greta works for the government," he added, his tone suggesting that my life was nothing more than a dull, stable routine of filing papers and watching the clock. I tightened my grip on my water glass until my knuckles turned white. They were talking about my 30-year career as if I were a part-time clerk at a local Walmart, completely ignoring the weight of the life I had actually lived. Mr. Jennings looked down at me with the squinted eyes of a man who measured human value solely by the size of a bank account. "Navy, huh?" he muttered, his voice gravelly and dismissive. "What is that, logistics or maybe human resources?" Chloe didn't even wait for me to answer because she wasn't looking for a conversation. She was looking for an audience. She turned to her father and let out a giggle that sounded like a razor blade dragged across a glass pane. "Daddy, you won't believe it, but while Mark is out there brokering million-dollar defense contracts, I bet Greta is the one deciding what goes on the menu in the ship's mess hall. Or maybe she picks out the floral arrangements for the captain's quarters," she continued, leaning in as if sharing a hilarious secret with the entire table. "I heard the military's really into that whole cozy feeling these days, right?" The entire group at table 19 erupted into laughter. Even the distant relatives and the children joined in, their amusement tearing through my sense of dignity like a jagged blade. The most painful part was Mark. Instead of standing up for me, instead of remembering the woman who had helped him when he had nothing, he just shrugged his shoulders. "Come on, Chloe. Don't tease her too hard," he said with a smirk. "Everybody needs a job to pay the bills, after all." In that single moment, they had reduced 30 years of sacrifice, of sleepless nights in the South China Sea, and of carrying the weight of hundreds of lives on my shoulders into a cheap joke about flower decorating. I took a deep breath and slowly set my glass down on the table. The sharp click of the glass against the wood was loud enough to slice right through Chloe's lingering laughter. I didn't look at her. She wasn't the one who mattered. Instead, I locked my eyes onto Mr. Jennings, who was just about to shove a piece of over-expensive Wagyu beef into his mouth with a silver fork. In that moment, the words of Theodore Roosevelt about the man in the arena echoed in the back of my mind, reminding me that the only people who truly count are the ones whose faces are marred by dust and sweat and blood. I adjusted my posture, feeling the familiar steel in my spine that had never failed me in a crisis. My voice was not loud, but it carried the cold, sharp edge of carbon steel. "No, Mr. Jennings," I said, my gaze holding his with an intensity that only comes from someone who has held the power of life and death in their hands. "I do not decorate ships, and I certainly do not plan the menus. I command them." The air at the table seemed to vanish instantly. Mr. Jennings froze, his hand trembling slightly as the silver fork hovered in mid-air. A second later, the fork slipped from his fingers and hit the porcelain plate with a sudden, jarring clang that rang out like a death knell for the family's arrogance. "Would you like me to continue with the next part of Greta's journey?" The sharp metallic clang of that silver fork hitting the porcelain plate at the wedding didn't just echo through the silent ballroom in Newport, it reverberated through the hollow chambers of my memory, pulling me back to a living room in Connecticut exactly 2 years ago. It was Christmas Eve at Aunt Clara's house, a night that was supposed to be filled with warmth and the spirit of giving. But for me, it was the night the cracks in our family's foundation became a canyon. Outside the window, the snow was falling in thick, heavy sheets, blanketing the world in a deceptive peace. Inside, the oversized fireplace roared with expensive birch logs, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and cinnamon. My family was gathered around a 10-foot-tall Christmas tree that looked like it belonged on the cover of a luxury magazine. I remember sitting on the edge of a velvet armchair, feeling the familiar weight of being the outsider in my own bloodline. Aunt Clara, her eyes welling with a performative kind of joy, reached under the tree and pulled out a small rectangular box wrapped in deep blue velvet. She handed it to Mark with a trembling hand, as if she were bestowing a crown. Mark had just been promoted to a mid-level manager at an investment fund, a job that mostly involved looking at spreadsheets and riding the waves of other people's money. He opened the box, and the light from the chandelier caught the polished steel of a Rolex Submariner. It was a $15,000 timepiece, a trophy for a boy who had never known a day of true struggle. Aunt Clara sobbed quietly, pulling her 28-year-old son into a suffocating embrace while declaring him the shining star of the family. The room erupted in applause, the sound of their approval ringing in my ears like a judgment. Mark slid the watch onto his wrist, the metal gleaming with a cold, mocking brilliance that seemed to laugh at my presence. Then it was my turn. Aunt Clara reached back under the tree, but this time she didn't pull out velvet. She handed me a small crinkled paper bag, the kind you get at a discount store and reuse until the handles fall off. She smiled at me, but it was the kind of smile you give to a stray dog you feel obligated to feed. "Greta, I found this at a TJ Maxx and immediately thought of you," she said, her voice airy and dismissive. I reached inside and pulled out a ceramic mug. It was a garish shade of pink, decorated with cheap gold glitter that spelled out the words "Boss Babe" in a cursive font that was as shallow as the sentiment behind it. I turned the mug over in my hands, and there it was. The ultimate insult left in plain sight. A white price tag that hadn't even been peeled off, showing a measly $4.99. Aunt Clara chuckled, patting my knee. "I figured you could use it for your coffee at the office," she added, "assuming that as an administrative worker, you probably need plenty of caffeine to stay awake while you type away at those computers all day." I held that mug, and I could feel the coldness of the ceramic seeping into my bones. It wasn't just a gift, it was a loud, clear statement about where I stood in their hierarchy. To them, I was a boring, single, middle-aged woman who pushed papers in a cubicle. A person of no consequence who deserved nothing more than a $5 clearance item. What they didn't know, and what they never bothered to ask, was that only 48 hours before that Christmas party, I had been standing on the bridge of a warship in the middle of the South China Sea. I had gone 72 hours without sleep, commanding a carrier strike group through the heart of a tropical storm while simultaneously managing a high-stakes standoff with foreign naval vessels. At that moment, I held the lives of over 5,000 sailors in the palm of my hand. I was coordinating the movements of F-35 fighter jets worth hundreds of millions of dollars, making split-second decisions that carried the weight of national security. Yet, in the eyes of Aunt Clara and Mark, all of that meant less than a single successful stock trade by the family's golden boy. I looked at the Boss Babe mug and felt a sudden, violent urge to hurl it into the fireplace. I wanted to stand up and scream that I was an admiral, that I had earned stripes they couldn't even dream of. But I didn't. I stayed silent because I remembered the promise I made to my father on his deathbed. He had grasped my hand with the last of his strength and told me to be patient with Clara, to be the bigger person because she simply didn't possess the vision to see the world beyond her own narrow interests. I had spent years swallowing that bitterness, much like the tasteless MRE rations I ate in the field. I forced a smile that day and thanked her for the mug, telling her it would be very useful. Mark had let out a sharp, mocking laugh, leaning back in his chair while admiring his Rolex. "Suits you, Greta," he sneered. "You are the ultimate boss babe after all." Those words felt like salt rubbed into a raw wound. I realized then that my silence wasn't being interpreted as grace or maturity. It was being seen as weakness. My willingness to endure their slights had only emboldened them to escalate their contempt. I looked at the crucifix hanging on the wall and thought about the ultimate sacrifice, the idea of forgiving those who know not what they do. But as I sat there in the silence of the wedding ballroom 2 years later, watching the shock on Mr. Jennings's face, I knew the era of forgiveness was over. My father had asked me to be patient, but he never asked me to be a doormat. They had spent a lifetime desecrating the temple of my honor, and the time had finally come to drive the merchants out. I was no longer the woman who would smile and accept a $5 mug while they wore $15,000 watches. I was the woman who commanded the steel that protected their very right to be so arrogant. Looking at that $5 mug sitting next to a Rolex makes my heart ache, because I know so many of you have felt that same sting of being the overlooked one in your own family. It is a lonely road when your sacrifices are treated like chores and your achievements are met with silence. If this part of Greta's story touched a nerve or reminded you of a time you were treated like an afterthought, please let me know. Like this video and leave a comment with the word valued if you believe that true worth isn't found in a price tag. I want to hear your thoughts as we walk this path together. The silence that followed the sound of that falling fork at the wedding was deafening, but in my mind, all I could hear was the echo of a phone call from 3 weeks ago. I was sitting in my office at the Pentagon, surrounded by the hum of secure servers and the sharp scent of overbrewed coffee that seems to permeate every hallway of that building. My desk was buried under strategic maps of the South China Sea and budget reports that would determine the readiness of the fleet for the next decade. The pressure was a physical weight on my shoulders, but I was used to it because in that world, responsibility is the air we breathe. Then my personal phone buzzed on the mahogany surface, and the name Clara flashed on the screen. I felt a familiar tighten in my chest because Clara never called just to check on me. I answered expecting to hear news about my grandmother or perhaps some minor family emergency, but instead I was met with her high-pitched, chirping voice that sounded completely oblivious to the gravity of where I was and what I was doing. "Greta, dear," she began without even asking if I was busy or how my day was going. She went on for 5 minutes about the wedding at Newport and how Chloe's father, Mr. Jennings, was the CEO of a massive aerospace company and a very important man. I rubbed my temples looking at a satellite feed of a carrier group moving through a storm while she prattled on about guest lists and high society connections. I told her I knew exactly who Mr. Jennings was and asked what that had to do with me. Clara's tone shifted, becoming sweet, yet sharp like a velvet glove hiding a set of claws as she explained that Mark was trying to close a massive deal with the man, and she needed me to do a tiny little favor. The favor turned out to be an arrow aimed directly at the heart of my identity. She asked me very casually, as if she were suggesting I change my hair color to please not wear my uniform to the wedding. She said that the white dress uniform was just a bit too aggressive and that Mr. Jennings was a man of peace and business who might find the sight of military regalia a bit intimidating. I sat there in stunned silence while she explained that she wanted the atmosphere to be intimate and friendly, and that my uniform might make the other guests feel uneasy. I felt a wave of cold shock wash over me because she was asking a Vice Admiral of the United States Navy to strip away the symbols of 30 years of service because it was too aggressive for a cocktail party. I reminded her that my full-dress whites were not just work clothes, but a representation of my honor and my commitment to this country. She just clicked her tongue dismissively and said that honor was a big word for what was essentially just a jumpsuit for a desk job, and begged me not to overshadow Mark on his big day. It was the ultimate act of invalidation, asking me to shrink myself so that her golden son could look taller in a room full of people who only valued what they could see in a bank account. But the insult didn't stop at the clothes because Clara had a script already written for my life. She leaned into the phone and whispered as if she were giving me a piece of profound advice, telling me not to mention my rank or my actual job title because it sounded too imposing and might scare the guests. She suggested that I just tell people I worked in logistics or human resources for the government, since that sounded much more approachable and didn't create any awkwardness. She told me she knew I loved my cousin and that this was the best way to support him before hanging up the phone before I could even find the words to respond. My hand was trembling with a fury so cold it felt like ice as I looked at the maps on my wall. Logistics and human resources were the words she chose to describe the woman who coordinated the movement of thousands of troops and billions of dollars in assets across the globe. A few minutes later, a text from Mark appeared on my screen, telling me that his mom had spoken to me and warning me not to make things weird, because Chloe's dad was a big gun and he didn't want me to embarrass him. He saw my life's work as a potential embarrassment to his social climbing, and his mother saw my uniform as a threat to her son's fragile ego. In that moment, the anger stopped being a fire and became a sharp, calculated tool of strategic logic. I didn't yell, and I didn't call her back to argue because I realized that they had just given me the greatest advantage possible in any conflict, which is being completely underestimated. I thought of the words of Napoleon about never interrupting an enemy when they are making a mistake, and I realized that my family was walking straight into a trap of their own making. They wanted me to be the invisible logistics clerk, and they wanted me to play the role of the quiet sister who didn't understand the big guns of the business world. I decided right then that I would give them exactly what they asked for, and I would wear the plain navy dress, and I would sit at the back table, and I would watch them bury themselves in their own arrogance. I typed back a short message to Mark, telling him that I had received the message and would do exactly as they wished, because I knew that the best way to show someone the value of what you do is to let them see what happens when that value is suddenly revealed in its full power. They thought they were protecting Mark's deal by hiding me, but they were actually setting the stage for the most spectacular failure of their lives. I felt a strange sense of peace as I returned to my maps because the battle hadn't even started yet, and I had already won the psychological ground. Would you like me to move forward with the next part of this story? I slid my phone back into the pocket of my slacks, the screen still glowing with Mark's dismissive text, and walked toward the heavy, soundproof doors of the Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility, or the SCIF as we call it. Behind me lay the noise of the outside world, the petty insults of people who measured power by the labels on their clothes. But ahead was the cold, silent reality of true authority. I stood before the biometric station, allowing the retinal scanner to map the unique patterns of my eyes, a process that felt more intimate and honest than any conversation I had with my Aunt Clara in years. The heavy steel door hissed open, granting me access to a room where the air was thick with the hum of high-powered servers and the pale blue glow of dozens of satellite monitors. In this windowless sanctuary, I wasn't an awkward cousin or a boring government clerk. I was a Vice Admiral of the United States Navy, the person responsible for the tactical movements of the 7th Fleet. Mark thought of Mr. Jennings as a big gun, because he owned a company that made parts for machines he didn't understand. But in this room, the only thing that mattered was who controlled the system. I sat at my command terminal, the high-back leather chair supporting my spine as I logged into the Department of Defense procurement database using my top-tier credentials. My fingers moved across the keyboard with a precision born of decades of discipline, searching not for a foreign threat this time, but for a domestic name that had just become my primary target: Jennings Aerospace. It took exactly 3 seconds for the system to populate the screen with the internal history of the company. Jennings Aerospace was listed as a Tier 2 subcontractor, primarily providing medium-range navigation radar systems for our naval vessels. As I scrolled through their recent financial reports, the picture became crystal clear. Their profit margins were hemorrhaging, and they were in a state of quiet, desperate panic. They weren't just looking for a deal, they were looking for a lifeline. And there it was, highlighted in a flashing red box that demanded my attention: Project Neptune. The status was listed as pending approval, a $2.4 billion contract aimed at upgrading the navigation arrays for an entire class of destroyers. This was the commercial holy grail Mark had mentioned, the deal that would either save Mr. Jennings's legacy or leave him bankrupt. I leaned back, a cold sense of realization washing over me as I looked at the electronic signature block at the bottom of the draft. The final authority to authorize or veto this entire expenditure rested with the commander of the fleet. That meant me. Mark had spent the morning trying to convince me not to embarrass him in front of his big gun, completely unaware that I was the one holding the hammer that could crush that gun into scrap metal. The irony was so thick I could almost taste it. A thin, predatory smile touched my lips as the strategy began to form in my mind. They wanted me to be a Trojan horse? Fine. I would play the part of the harmless, invisible cousin, infiltrating their world of vanity and arrogance, and I would wait for them to expose their true nature before I opened the gates. I pressed the intercom button on my desk and summoned Lieutenant Commander Evans. Within 30 seconds, he was at my door, his posture as straight and unyielding as a steel beam. Evans was more than an aide. He was a man who had seen me lead through the darkest nights at sea, and he knew that look in my eyes. I turned my chair to face him, my voice dropping into the quiet, lethal tone I used only when a mission was underway. "Evans," I asked, "do you have any plans for this coming weekend?" He didn't hesitate for a second before telling me his time was at my disposal. I told him to have his full-dress whites cleaned and pressed because we were going to a wedding in Newport. He looked surprised, his eyebrows twitching slightly, but he didn't ask a single question. He simply stood at attention and asked for the rules of engagement. I looked at him, my eyes hard and focused like the lens of a sniper scope. "Stealth and destroy," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "You will carry the unredacted performance review files for Project Neptune with you. I want every technical failure and every cost overrun highlighted in a way that can't be ignored. We are going to conduct a real-time performance review right in the middle of their champagne toast." Evans smiled then, a sharp, knowing grin that told me he understood exactly what was at stake. As he turned to leave, I reached for my phone one last time. I typed out a response to Mark and Clara, my thumbs moving slowly and deliberately. I told them that I received their message and that I would wear a plain dress and keep my career out of the conversation, promising them that I would not do anything to make them lose face. I hit the send button, feeling the weight of that lie as it traveled through the airwaves. It was a tactical deception of the highest order. They thought they had successfully managed me, that they had tucked me away into a corner where I couldn't disturb their social climbing. They had no idea that they had just invited the most dangerous person in their world to the table, and that I was coming with the power to dismantle their entire future. The trap was set, and all I had to do now was wait for the music to start. Standing at Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii, before we boarded the civilian-disguised Gulfstream jet, Lieutenant Commander Evans approached me with 2 steaming cups of coffee in his hands. The morning air was warm and smelled of jet fuel and sea salt, a familiar comfort that usually centered me, but today my mind was miles away in Newport. Evans looked at me, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding that bypassed the need for official rank or protocol. He hesitated for a moment, shifting his weight before speaking in a low, respectful voice. He told me that he knew I had asked him to come along for the mission, but he wanted me to know that he was also there because he wanted to be. He had seen how my family treated me during those rare holiday calls, and it sat wrong with him. I looked at him, remembering that he was supposed to be off this weekend, watching his daughter Sarah play in her championship soccer game. I told him he didn't have to do this, that Sarah only had one childhood, and he should be there for her. Evans just shook his head firmly, telling me that when he told Sarah he had to go, she looked at him and said that Admiral Wooten always protects them. So it was his turn to go and protect me. He told me that to the crew, I was their family, and they took care of their own. My throat tightened as a wave of emotion I wasn't prepared for washed over me. A 10-year-old girl understood the weight of loyalty and sacrifice better than my own 30-year-old cousin ever could. As the plane climbed into the sky, leaving the golden Hawaiian sun behind to chase the cold winter of the East Coast, I stared out the small oval window at the endless blue of the Pacific. Somewhere down there, scattered across that vast expanse of water, thousands of my sailors were standing watch on steel decks, trusting me with their lives. Behind my back, they called me Old Mom, a title they used with a mixture of reverence and affection because they knew I would go to the ends of the earth to bring them home. I was flying 5,000 miles to see the people who shared my blood, yet they were the only ones who saw me as an invisible, aging clerk who was barely capable of picking out a dinner menu. The geographical distance could be measured in miles, but the emotional chasm between me and Mark's world was a void that no instrument could ever truly map. A profound sense of loneliness crept into my chest, a coldness that felt sharper than the pressurized air at 30,000 feet. I realized that the people who were supposed to know me best were the ones who didn't know me at all, while the strangers I led into battle were the ones who saw the truth of my soul. When we finally touched down at the airport in Providence, Rhode Island, there was no welcoming committee and no family car waiting at the curb. My Aunt Clara didn't bother to show up, which was exactly what I expected. Instead, my phone buzzed with a short, dismissive text telling me to just catch an Uber to the hotel, because she and Mark were too busy doing a private wine tasting with the Jennings family. She added a final sting, reminding me to make sure the dress I wore tomorrow was modest and plain, warning me not to do anything too over the top that might draw attention away from the wedding party. I read the message aloud to Evans, who was already gripping the steering wheel of our rental car so hard his knuckles were white. He asked me if I wanted him to call in a few favors, or perhaps just drive the car through the front gates of their mansion to give them a real surprise. I couldn't help but let out a tired, sad laugh, telling him to stay patient because revenge is a dish best served when it has had plenty of time to cool. I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror and saw a woman who looked nothing like the powerful vice admiral the world knew. I just looked like a forgotten niece, another guest sitting at the edge of someone else's spotlight. That night, I sat alone in the dim light of a mediocre hotel room that Clara had booked for me, miles away from the 5-star resort where the rest of the VIP guests were staying. I pulled an old, weathered photograph from my wallet, its edges frayed from years of being carried across oceans. It was a picture of my father in his dress whites, holding me when I was just a little girl, his smile full of a pride that I hadn't felt from anyone in my family since the day he died. He was the one who taught me that true honor wasn't found in the medals pinned to your chest, but in how you stood your ground when the world tried to make you small. I whispered an apology to his image, knowing that tomorrow I would have to break my promise to keep the peace. I could no longer allow them to trample over everything we had built, not just for my sake, but for the sake of the uniform he wore and the legacy he left behind. I closed my eyes and took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the familiar resolve of a commander preparing for a final engagement. Tomorrow, I wasn't walking into a wedding as a victim. I was walking into the arena as the master of the game. And for the first time in a long time, I felt completely at peace with the storm that was about to break. The wedding ceremony at the edge of the ocean in Newport was a masterpiece of orchestrated vanity. But as the crowd moved into the reception hall, the reality of my status in this family became impossible to ignore. I walked toward the seating chart, my eyes scanning the names at the top of the list, looking for my place among the relatives. I passed table 1, where Aunt Clara and the VIPs sat in the glow of $1,000 centerpieces, and table 2, where Mark and Chloe were already being toasted. I kept walking until I reached the very bottom of the list, finding my name at table 19. The location was the ultimate insult, a dark corner at the furthest point from the stage, tucked right against the swinging double doors of the kitchen and a massive bass speaker that vibrated through my chair. My companions for the evening were two freelance photographers trying to wolf down their meals before the next dance, a distant elderly cousin who had lost her hearing, and three young children who were already screaming for their iPads. I, the oldest cousin of the groom, and the woman who had practically raised him during our summers, was being treated as an afterthought, relegated to the cheap seats with the hired help. From my vantage point, I could see Mark and Chloe at the center of the room, glowing under the crystal chandeliers as they sipped Dom Perignon. On my table, there were only plastic bottles of water and a basket of stale bread. I felt a wave of isolation wash over me, a loneliness that was far more painful than anything I had felt on the deck of a ship in the middle of a storm. I had barely settled into my seat when Aunt Clara swept toward me like a hurricane of expensive perfume and frantic energy. She didn't ask how I was doing or if I had enjoyed the ceremony. Instead, she thrust a heavy stack of gift bags into my arms. She told me she was so glad I was there because she needed someone she could trust to keep an eye on the VIP gift bags so they wouldn't get lost in the chaos. She looked around with a pinched expression, telling me that since I was so used to managing personnel or whatever it was I did for the government, I should also keep an eye on the servers and make sure they cleared the plates faster. She spoke to me as if I were a nameless, unpaid event coordinator rather than a vice admiral who commanded 5,000 sailors. She didn't see the irony of asking a master of logistics to manage a pile of party favors while her son pretended to be the big shot of the evening. I felt the familiar weight of stoic discipline settling over me, the internal wall I had built to survive decades of high-stakes command now protecting me from her petty arrows. I simply took the bags and gave her a thin, polite smile, telling her she could count on me. My compliance was the perfect mask, hide the fire that was beginning to burn with a steady, calculated heat in my chest. Mark walked past table 19 on his way toward the bar, and for a brief second our eyes met. He stopped and looked at me, surrounded by the screaming children and the mountain of gift bags, and he let out a sharp, mocking laugh. He told me that I looked quite natural in my element, like a tired nanny or a soccer mom trying to keep things from falling apart. He straightened his silk bow tie and leaned in, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper as he told me to remember our deal and keep my mouth shut about my rank, because Mr. Jennings was already having a wonderful time. He told me that his entire future depended on this night and warned me not to do anything to make him look bad in front of the big guns. He spoke with such a profound lack of gratitude that I didn't even feel the sting of his words anymore. Instead, I felt a deep, cold pity for him. He was selling his soul for a deal that was already crumbling, and he was too blinded by his own vanity to see that the person he was stepping on was the only one who could save him. He walked away without a single thank you, leaving me in the shadows of the bass speaker while he went back to the lights and the cameras. I checked the time on my phone, seeing it was exactly 1945. A message from Evans appeared on the screen, telling me he was in the parking lot and waiting for my signal. I typed back a short response, telling him to give me 15 more minutes. I stood up from the forgotten corner of table 19 and walked toward the sculpted ice bar to get a glass of water, trying to clear the static of the room from my head. That was when Chloe saw me. She was standing with her father, Mr. Jennings, and a circle of their wealthy friends, their laughter ringing out like broken glass. She caught my eye and leaned in to whisper something to her father, pointing toward my plain navy dress with a look of malicious delight. They both looked at me and laughed. A cruel, shared moment of superiority that was meant to put me in my place once and for all. It was the exact moment I had walked into at the very beginning of this journey, the final provocation that snapped the last cord of my patience. I took a deep breath, my fingers tightening around the cold glass in my hand as the predator within me finally took the lead. I was ready to stop being the invisible cousin and start being the admiral they had so foolishly invited to their table. The stage was set, the devils were laughing, and I was about to show them exactly what happens when you underestimate the person who holds the power to end your world. There is a specific kind of pain in being treated like a stranger by the people who share your blood, especially when you are the one quietly holding everything together. I know many of you have sat at your own version of Table 19, watching the world celebrate while you were left in the shadows. If you have ever felt like the invisible one in your family, or if you're just waiting for Greta to finally show them who she really is, please support this story. Like this video and comment with the word justice or a heart emoji if you believe it is time for the truth to come out. Let's stand together as a family that actually chooses one another. The silver fork on Mr. Jennings's hand hit the porcelain plate with a jarring metallic clang that seemed to echo into every corner of the ballroom. The sound was sharp and final, like a gavel bringing a court to order. And the silence that followed was so thick you could almost feel it pressing against your skin. Mr. Jennings sat there with his mouth slightly open, a piece of expensive Wagyu beef falling from his fork and landing unceremoniously on the pristine white tablecloth. He looked at me with eyes that were suddenly wide with a mixture of confusion and a rising, cold dread. "Commander," he stammered, his voice sounding thin and brittle as a bead of sweat began to roll down his forehead. He asked if I meant a captain of a transport ship, or perhaps something in the merchant marine. Chloe, sensing the sudden shift in the air, tried to let out her signature giggle, but it came out as a strangled, desperate sound. She reached out to touch her father's arm, telling him that I was obviously just exaggerating or playing a joke, and reminded everyone that I worked in government logistics. I didn't say a word to correct her. I didn't have to. I simply sat there with a calm, level gaze and a smile that never reached my eyes, watching the realization slowly begin to dawn on the man who controlled billions, but suddenly realized he controlled nothing at this table. I knew that my reinforcements had arrived exactly on time. At that precise moment, the heavy double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom were pushed open with a quiet, forceful authority. It felt as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room in a single breath. Lieutenant Commander Evans stepped into the hall, and the contrast between him and the crowd of men in rented tuxedos was almost violent. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was in his full-dress whites, the Navy's highest ceremonial uniform. And it was so white it seemed to glow under the crystal chandeliers. The gold shoulder boards on his coat gleamed with an unmistakable weight, and the rows of medals and service ribbons on his chest caught the light with every steady step he took. He wore his combination cover with the brim low over his eyes, his posture as straight and unyielding as a mast in a gale. He didn't look at the wedding party, and he didn't acknowledge the guests who were now whispering and pointing in shock. He walked with a disciplined, military stride right through the heart of the elite Newport crowd, his eyes locked on the forgotten corner of the room where Table 19 sat. The entire ballroom fell into a state of stunned awe as they watched this high-ranking officer move toward the woman they had spent the whole night ignoring. Evans stopped exactly 2 paces in front of me, his movements as precise as a clockwork mechanism. He brought his heels together with a sharp, disciplined thud that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. Then he raised his hand in a slow, perfect military salute, his fingers straight and his eyes fixed on mine with a loyalty that was absolute. "Vice Admiral Wooten," he announced, his voice projecting with a resonance that cut through the lingering jazz music and filled the entire hall. He reported that the secure Level 1 link to the Pentagon was ready for the emergency budget session regarding Project Neptune. He apologized for the interruption, but stated that the secretary required my personal sign-off before the final funding decision was moved to the president's desk. I slowly began to stand up, smoothing out my simple navy dress as if it were a royal robe. I acknowledged him with a calm, authoritative nod and told him to stand at ease. The transformation was complete. I was no longer the invisible cousin or the administrative clerk. I was the commander of the very steel that defined their world. The entire ballroom remained in a state of absolute paralysis. Aunt Clara, who had been standing nearby holding a glass of expensive red wine, was trembling so violently that the glass slipped from her fingers. It shattered on the marble floor with a spray of crimson that looked like blood, splashing directly onto the hem of Chloe's white Vera Wang wedding dress. But Chloe didn't even notice the stain. She was staring at me with a face that had turned the color of ash, her mouth working but no sound coming out. Mr. Jennings, however, reacted with the survival instinct of a man who realized he was standing on the edge of a cliff. He scrambled to his feet so fast he knocked his chair over, standing at an awkward, rigid attention like a terrified recruit at boot camp. He looked at me, his face pale and his voice shaking, as he asked if I was indeed Admiral Wooten from Indopacom, the woman responsible for the final review of the Neptune contract. He realized in that heartbeat that he had spent the evening mocking the one person who held the $2.4 billion lifeline of his entire company in her hands. I looked at him, my voice quiet and light but carrying the weight of 1,000 ships. "That is correct, Mr. Jennings," I said. "And as for the floral arrangements on the ships, I can assure you that I have never once been asked to pick them out." I turned to Evans, ready to leave the wreckage of their arrogance behind. "Would you like me to continue with the next part of this story?" "Sit down, Mr. Jennings," I said, and it was not an invitation. It was a command issued with the same absolute authority I used when ordering a fleet into a storm. The man who had been laughing at me moments ago suddenly looked like a terrified recruit at a drill sergeant's mercy as he fumbled with his silk tie and lowered himself into the cheap folding chair at table 19. Evans moved with practiced efficiency, clearing away the half-eaten plates of wedding cake to make room for a thick black dossier that he placed on the table with a heavy thud. I didn't look at the crowd or the sparkling chandeliers. I only looked at the man across from me, who was now visibly trembling. I flipped open the folder to a page marked with a red top secret stamp and pointed to a specific set of data points. "Your fourth-generation radar systems showed a 0.5-second latency during the field trials off the coast of Virginia last week." I stated, my voice as flat and emotionless as a weather report. "In naval combat, 0.5 seconds is the exact amount of time it takes for a supersonic missile to bridge the gap between a successful intercept and the total destruction of my ship. That half-second is the difference between my sailors going home to their families or being buried at sea. And you have the audacity to expect me to sign off on a $2 billion contract for what is essentially a pile of unreliable scrap metal." Mr. Jennings was sweating profusely now, his face pale as he stammered about software patches and development cycles, but I simply turned the page showing him a list of cost overruns that would make a senator scream. Mark, seeing his future father-in-law being dismantled in front of the very guests he had hoped to impress, decided to try and play the hero. He pushed through the circle of gawking relatives and tried to place a hand on my shoulder, his voice loud and performative. "Greta, what are you doing? This is my wedding day. You can't just come in here and bully Mr. Jennings like this," he yelled, trying to regain control of the room. I didn't even look up, but Evans moved before Mark could finish his sentence. Standing at 6'3" and radiating the raw power of a man who had seen combat, Evans stepped between us like a wall of living steel. "Step back 3 meters, sister." Evans said, his voice a low predatory growl that made Mark freeze in his tracks. "This is a classified discussion regarding national security, and you do not possess the required top-secret security clearance to be within earshot of this dossier. If you take one more step forward, I will be forced to detain you for obstructing a flag officer in the performance of her duties." Mark turned a sickly shade of white, his bravado evaporating as he realized he was being treated like a child at his own party. He stumbled backward, tripping over the long train of Chloe's wedding dress and looking every bit the insignificant boy he had always been. Chloe was standing just behind him, her eyes welled with tears of pure rage and humiliation as she watched her father cower before the woman she had mocked as a lowly clerk. I finally turned my gaze to her, the coldness in my eyes making her flinch. "Chloe, you asked me earlier if I decorated ships or planned the menus for the crew," I said, my words cutting through the air like a blade. "The answer is no, I do not decorate anything. But I do have the final authority to decide whether your father's company remains solvent enough for you to afford your next designer gown or whether it ceases to exist by Monday morning." I closed the dossier with a sharp snap that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. Here is a bit of professional advice that you should take to heart before you decide to mock someone's career ever again. Make sure that person isn't the one who holds your entire family's financial future in her hands. You spent the evening trying to make me feel small, but you forgot that while you were playing princess, I was learning how to command the very world you live in. I stood up from the table, my movements calm and deliberate, as I looked down at Mr. Jennings one last time. I am giving you 48 hours to provide a certified solution for that latency issue, and Evans will be sending you the technical requirements by midnight. If a satisfactory report is not sitting on my desk by Monday morning, Project Neptune is dead, and I will ensure that every single branch of the United States military blacklists Jennings Aerospace for the next decade. Mr. Jennings nodded his head frantically, his voice a desperate whisper as he thanked me for the opportunity and apologized for his daughter's unforgivable disrespect. I didn't wait for his gratitude. I simply turned and walked toward the exit with Evans following a precise 2 steps behind me, his boots echoing against the marble floor. We left table 19 and the entire wreckage of their arrogance behind us, walking out of the ballroom and into the cool night air. The party was still technically going on inside, but for Mark, Chloe, and Aunt Clara, the celebration had ended the moment the truth came out. They had wanted to keep me in the shadows, but they had accidentally dragged the sun into their room, and now they were the ones blinded by the light. I had not even managed to cross the threshold of the grand ballroom before Aunt Clara intercepted me with a speed that was almost predatory. The cold and dismissive sneer that had occupied her face all evening was gone, replaced by a mask of nauseating flattery that made my stomach churn with a violent sense of revulsion. She lunged forward and grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin as she began to weep performative crocodile tears for the benefit of the surrounding guests who were now watching us with rapt attention. "Oh, Greta," she wailed, her voice thick with a fake sincerity that set my teeth on edge. "Why didn't you tell us you were a vice admiral?" She started shouting to anyone within earshot that I was the absolute pride of the Wooten family, and began trying to drag me back toward the center of the room to find the main wedding photographer. She demanded that Mark come over immediately so they could capture a family portrait with his heroic sister, as if a single picture could erase decades of systematic exclusion. She was already working to rewrite the history of the evening, loudly claiming to a group of socialites that she had always known I was someone special and that she had never truly liked Chloe because the girl was so disrespectful. It was a 180-degree shift in personality that was as dizzying as it was disgusting. A textbook example of the conditional love that had defined my place in this family since the day I was born. I looked down at her hand on my sleeve and then directly into her eyes, feeling a sense of emotional distance that was as vast as the ocean I commanded. I gently but very firmly pried her fingers away from my dress, refusing to allow her to use my uniform or my rank as a prop for her desperate social recovery. "Aunt Clara," I said, my voice dropping into a calm and lethal register that effectively silenced her frantic babbling, "have you already forgotten what you told me less than an hour ago?" I reminded her of the specific instructions she had given me at table 19, where she told me to spend my time clearing away the dirty glasses and making sure the hired servers moved faster, because I was so suited for that kind of manual labor. I told her that I was simply following her orders and that I was on my way to do exactly as she asked, though I was starting by removing myself from the largest mess in the room. She stood there in a state of absolute paralysis, her face flushing a deep and embarrassed red before fading into a sickly shade of white as she tried to stammer that she had only been joking. I shook my head slowly, telling her that she had never been more honest than when she was looking down on me, and I explained that I was no longer a tool she could pick up and put down whenever it suited her vanity. I was too big for her world now, and I had no intention of ever shrinking myself again. Mark was standing just behind his mother, looking like a drenched bird that had just realized the nest was gone and the storm was only getting worse. He didn't look at me with any genuine sense of pride or even with a shred of honest apology. Instead, his eyes were darting around the ballroom with a selfish fear that was painful to witness. He stepped forward and tried to whisper my name, his voice trembling as he begged me to say something to Mr. Jennings on his behalf. He told me that his father-in-law was threatening to call off the wedding and cancel every business contract they had together because he believed Mark was an incompetent liability for not knowing the true identity of his own sister. It was the ultimate display of cowardice from a man who didn't care about the years of insults I had endured, but only about the potential loss of his golden ticket to a life of unearned luxury. I looked at the man I had once protected and helped through his darkest times and felt a profound sense of pity for the vacuum where his character should have been. "Mark," I said, looking him in the eye for what I knew would be the last time. Mr. Jennings is not walking away because you missed my rank. He's walking away because he finally saw that you are a man without a spine, a man who would watch his own sister be humiliated just to keep a business deal alive. I told him that I spend my days commanding thousands of brave men and women who would die for one another, and I have no more room in my life for a coward who only loves when it is convenient. I told him to handle his own wreckage because I was finished being his shield. I turned my back on them and walked out of the massive gilded doors of the breakers, leaving the suffocating atmosphere of lies and expensive perfume behind me. The Rhode Island night air hit me with a sharp and salt-tinged chill that felt more refreshing than any champagne they had served inside that mansion. I took a deep, steadying breath, savoring the sound of the ocean crashing against the cliffs, instead of the hollow laughter of people who didn't know the meaning of the word honor. Evans was waiting by the car, the engine running and the door open for me in a silent gesture of the only kind of loyalty that truly matters. As I climbed into the passenger seat, I looked back at the lights of the ballroom one last time, seeing the silhouettes of the people who shared my blood but would never understand my soul. I remembered the ancient instruction to shake the dust off your feet when you leave a place that does not know your value. And I felt a sense of liberation that was more powerful than any rank or medal. Evans asked if we were heading back to the hotel to pack, and I looked out at the dark horizon where the sea met the sky. No, Evans, I told him, take me straight to the airport. I want to go home, and for me, home is no longer a house full of strangers who look like me. Home is the fleet, where my family is defined by the depth of their character and the strength of their word. I felt a strange and beautiful sense of peace as we drove away from Newport, knowing that while I had lost a family of blood, I had finally found the strength to keep the family I had chosen. It has been exactly 1 year since that cold, salt-tinged night in Newport, and as I stand here on the bridge of the USS Gerald R. Ford, the world feels larger and more filled with light than I ever thought possible. The Pacific Ocean stretches out before me in an endless expanse of deep, shimmering blue, a canvas that holds no memory of petty insults or social climbing. The air out here carries the sharp, clean scent of freedom, a far cry from the suffocating weight of expensive perfume and hidden agendas that used to define my life. Captain Evans, who earned his new rank through the same quiet excellence he has always shown, approaches me with a steaming cup of coffee. He doesn't hand it to me in a cheap, pink ceramic mug decorated with gold glitter. This mug is made of heavy-duty brushed steel, engraved with the proud logo of the 7th Fleet, and scarred with the honest scratches of a year spent at sea. It is a vessel built for endurance, much like the woman holding it. Evans gives me a crisp, respectful nod as he reports that the Neptune radar systems are performing perfectly, exceeding every technical benchmark we set. Mr. Jennings kept his word, not because he found his conscience, but because he finally understood that the consequences of failing me were far greater than any profit margin. His company survived, but it operates now under the absolute, unyielding standard of the United States Navy, a legacy of competence born from the wreckage of his own arrogance. Evans hesitates for a moment, a familiar look of concern crossing his face as he pulls a small envelope from his pocket. He tells me that a letter arrived from my family lawyer back in Connecticut, something he thought I should see. I take the envelope and open it, the paper feeling thin and fragile against the wind whipping across the deck. The news from the mainland is as predictable as it is hollow. Mark and Chloe's marriage, built on a foundation of greed and social vanity, collapsed in a bitter divorce only 6 months after the wedding. Mr. Jennings, realizing that Mark was nothing more than a parasitic liability, cut off every cent of financial support and forced Chloe to take an unpaid internship just to learn the basic value of a day's work. My phone buzzed briefly in my pocket with a message from a number I didn't recognize, but the voice was unmistakable. It was Aunt Clara, begging for help with her mortgage and asking why I would be so cruel as to ignore my own brother when I have so much. I read her words, and I don't feel the sharp sting of anger or even the cold satisfaction of revenge. All I feel is a profound, quiet emptiness, a realization that they are exactly where they have always been, trapped in a cycle of using people as stepping stones. I slowly fold the paper and drop it into the recycling bin, watching it disappear. They will always be parasites, looking for a host to sustain their delusions. But the woman who once let them bleed her dry is gone, replaced by someone who finally knows her own worth. The ship's whistle sounds, a deep and resonant blast that signals the change of the watch. Below me on the flight deck, hundreds of young sailors are moving with a synchronized purpose, their faces tanned by the sun and filled with a vibrant energy that reminds me why I chose this life. A young female officer, her eyes bright with ambition and her uniform perfectly pressed, stops as she passes the bridge and offers me a sharp, proud salute. She thanks me for the tactical training session we held yesterday, telling me that it changed the way she looks at leadership. I offer her a genuine smile and a nod of encouragement, watching her walk away with a confidence that I didn't find until I was twice her age. This is my real family, the people who don't share a drop of my blood but would walk through fire to protect the mission we share. They don't respect me because I have a big house or because I wear an expensive watch. They respect me because I lead them with integrity and because they know I would never ask them to do something I wouldn't do myself. I think of the words of Mother Teresa about how the trouble with the world is that we draw our family circles too small. Standing here, looking out at the thousands of men and women who look to me for guidance, I realize that I have drawn my circle to encompass the entire ocean. And for the first time in my life, I am not alone. I take a slow sip of the black coffee, finding comfort in the bitter heat and the sweet, lingering aftertaste. I am reminded of a quote by Admiral Grace Hopper, a woman who paved the way for every person standing on this deck today. She said that a ship in harbor is safe, but that is not what ships are built for. For years, I tried to stay moored in the stagnant, rotting harbor of my aunt's approval, thinking that safety was found in being quiet and being small. I tried to be the paper boat they wanted me to be, floating in their shallow bowl of vanity. But I was never meant for the harbor. I am a warship, forged in the fires of discipline and built to navigate the most treacherous storms the world can throw at me. I belong to the deep water, to the places where character is the only currency that matters and where your word is the only thing that keeps you afloat. The sun is beginning to rise over the horizon, painting the surface of the sea in shades of gold and orange, a new dawn that I created with my own hands and my own courage. It is bright, it is eternal, and it belongs only to me. I turn to Captain Evans, the steel in my voice matched only by the peace in my heart. Take us forward, Captain, I order. Our course is set and we have a whole world to protect. Greta's journey serves as a powerful reminder that your intrinsic value is never defined by those who are unable to see it. True strength is not found in material wealth or social status, but in the quiet integrity of your own character and the resilience you show when faced with adversity. Setting firm boundaries with toxic relationships is not an act of bitterness. It is a necessary step toward reclaiming your inner peace and self-respect. You are the commander of your own life, and your legacy is built by the people you choose to uplift and protect along the way. Harper Vance hopes that Greta's triumph has brought a sense of validation and strength to your own heart today. We have all experienced moments of being overlooked, but your worth remains unshakable even in the shadows of someone else's vanity. If Greta's story touched a nerve or helped you feel seen, please share your thoughts or a personal experience in the comments below. Your voice is a vital part of this community. Please like this video and subscribe to support more stories of resilience, and tell us, have you ever had to choose your own peace over a toxic family bond?